to ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of its work to tackle the poverty-related educational attainment gap in light of the gap reportedly widening across all school qualifications in the recent exam results.
Cabinet Secretary Ms Gilruth.
The most recent set of results from Scotland's schools show that for National 5 and higher, the attainment gap has returned to levels broadly comparable with those in 2019, the last comparable year on record due to changes made during the pandemic to qualifications requirements. The results also show record levels of young people achieving technical and vocational qualifications with an almost 25% increase on the year prior. And there has been an increase in students from the most disadvantaged communities gaining a place in higher education, with a 12% increase this year alone. Notwithstanding, it is clear that the pandemic is continuing to have a lasting impact on our children and young people here and elsewhere in the UK. Responding to this year's results, I convened a meeting with Directors of Education to focus on improvement and local variation, along with the Chief Examiner and Interim Chief Inspector. It is imperative that Government work to drive improvement in our schools post-pandemic, and to that end, I will set out further detail pertaining to the Government's response in the coming weeks in relation to qualification reform and school improvement.
Willie Rennie.
The Education Secretary chooses her milestones very carefully. She knows that this Government will be measured on its promise made in 2016 to close the poverty-related attainment gap. So 8 years into that promise, how confident is she that that promise will be delivered by 2026?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Rennie for his question. I think it is worthwhile pointing out the progress that has been made thus far in relation to closing the gap. I don't take away from some of the challenge, and of course some of that challenge is not of this Government's making. But we have seen a narrowing of the gap in Primary 7, for example, in literacy and numeracy in December statistics. We've also seen, though, progress in relation to our young people going on to positive destinations since 2009. The attainment gap has narrowed by 60% in that regard. And again, as I intimated in my initial response, we've seen really strong progress this year in terms of widening access, with a 12% increase in university acceptance for those from our poorest communities. I don't take away from the ongoing challenge here, but I do hope that Mr Rennie can recognise that progress. And of course, I would say that the financial context within which the Government is operating is also relevant here, because if we continue to see an austerity agenda being pursued by the Westminster Government, irrespective of party, that is going to hamper the progress I am able to make as Education Secretary, because I will have less money at my disposal to make the necessary progress we need to see in closing the gap.
Willie Rennie.
It does seem that the SNP Government are focused more on finding excuses than they are on closing the poverty-related attainment gap. She's also incredibly selective with her statistics, and I know we all like to choose our own statistics, but she is going to be measured on the poverty-related attainment gap as set out by the former First Minister in 2016. So what does the Education Secretary say to those thousands of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who the promise was made to them but has failed to be delivered so far?
Cabinet Secretary.
For his question, he talks about selective use of statistics, and of course when I was teaching modern studies we used to talk about being selective in your use of facts. So in my initial response to Mr Rennie, I talked about National 5 and higher, and Mr Rennie might want to look at the results this year for Advanced Higher, where we have seen a slight widening of the gap. Why is that the case in relation to that qualification? Because we've seen an increase in relation to the number of students sitting that qualification. I think that's a good thing, because in the past, certainly when I was at school back in Mr Rennie's constituency some time ago now, there was gatekeeping in relation to that qualification. So it used to be in the past that children were essentially told they weren't bright enough to sit that qualification. I don't think that was right, and I think we've now seen a far broader approach to qualification entry, and undoubtedly that will impact in relation to attainment. But we have seen progress in relation to closing the gap. I rehearsed some of the narrative there in relation to our performance at Primary 7 level, and of course in terms of positive destinations. But the final point I would make is this, Presiding Officer. Scotland is not an outlier in relation to closing the poverty-related attainment gap. For both A-levels and GCSEs this year, the gap between the highest and the lowest performing regions in England has grown and remains higher than it was before the pandemic. I'm not using this as an excuse to Mr Rennie's point. What I would say is that context in Scotland is felt all over the UK, and the cohort of young people
Briefly, Cabinet Secretary.
Right now have lived through a global pandemic, and we should all be mindful about what that means in relation to their outcomes as a result.
I'm keen to have more members, for more members to have an opportunity to put questions, concise questions and responses appreciated. Liam Kerr.
Presiding Officer, 8 years since the promise was made, is the Cabinet Secretary in a position to provide us with a credible written strategic plan that she's working to close the poverty-related attainment gap, or is she making it up as she goes along?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think, as Mr Kerr is well aware, this government plan is the Scottish Attainment Challenge, which has over £1 billion of funding coming to closing the poverty-related attainment gap during this parliamentary session. Well, Mr Kerr doesn't think that's a good idea. I think it's a pretty substantive plan. He should engage with the detail of it if he's interested. However, if he also listened to my initial response, and I hope he was, I stated very clearly that I will give a written and a fulsome update in relation to qualification reform in the coming weeks, and that will set out a clear trajectory in relation to improvement.
Roddick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Central to the poverty-related attainment gap is clearly the issue of poverty itself, with thousands of children being pushed into poverty by the austerity agenda, which the Liberal Democrats were central to ushering in. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that one of the most important things that we can do in improving educational attainment is to eradicate child poverty?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think the member makes a hugely important point. Of course, what drives the attainment gap is poverty caused by more than a decade of austerity and brutal cuts, supported by both Labour and the Tories. So children and families are bearing the brunt of Tory cuts to social security and brutal policies like the two-child limit, which of course we now know is supported by Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. We know too, Presiding Officer, that modelling published estimates that Scottish Government policies will keep 100,000 children out of relative poverty in 24-25, with relative poverty levels 10 percentage points lower than they would have otherwise been. But meanwhile, the Tories and Labour are committed to doubling down on austerity, and that impacts on attainment and poverty.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary said at the weekend she can't raise attainment with fewer teachers, yet teacher numbers will this year be cut. Later this afternoon, it's likely we'll hear of further pressures to local government and school budgets. Far from reforming anything in education, the Cabinet Secretary is putting forward an education bill that essentially achieves very little. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, fewer teachers, fewer resources and what's been dubbed as pretty meaningless reform, is this really the plan to raise attainment and close the poverty-related attainment gap?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank Ms Duncan-Glancy for her question, and of course I'm sure she will recognise there was actually an increase in secondary teachers last year. I'm sure she would want to record that fact. And of course in Scotland we have the lowest pupil-teacher ratio, far lower, for example, than in Labour-run Wales. I'm sure the member would also like to recognise that. And of course I'm sure she would like to recognise that we spend more per pupil in Scotland than any other part of the UK. I'm sure she would also like to recognise that. And of course I'm sure Ms Duncan-Glancy would love to recognise that Scottish teachers are the best paid in the UK because of investment from this government. Now, the member talks about reform, and I look forward to engaging with her in that process to better improve the outcomes for Scotland's children and young people, but I very much hope that she can recognise the inputs from this government in supporting our education system.
And Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. What assessment has the Cabinet Secretary made in respect to attainment on the impact of the increasing levels of violence and threat being reported in classrooms on the teaching and learning environment, and what will she do about it?
I thank the member for his question. Of course, I know he takes a keen interest in this matter, and I hope he will be attending my statement on the Behaviour Action Plan, which I will give to Parliament later. Today, he will be aware that we published the Action Plan 2 weeks ago now, and that Action Plan responds to the assessment the Government undertook on the impact of behaviour in relation to attainment. That was published in the Behaviour in Scotland Schools research towards the end of last year. So I'd encourage him to engage with that data if he hasn't already done so, and I look forward to engaging with him further in the statement later today.
Thank you. That concludes topical questions.